Hello and welcome back, adventurers. This is Captain TTRPG, and today we're talking about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Hello, adventurers, and welcome back today. We are talking about ranged weapons. Guns, bows, throwing axes. I'm a huge fan of ranged weapons in RPGs, and I want to make sure that you feel good about using them in Pathfinder 2nd Edition because they add a whole different dynamic to the game. We already covered melee weapons in a previous video. If you haven't checked that out, go ahead and check that out. Some of those still apply here. Just like in that video, here we're going to talk about the types of ranged weapons, break down how to read a stat block for the weapon, and talk about the most common traits for ranged weapons. I find that in a lot of RPGs, TTRPGs, video games, there's a lot of melee weapons and a lot of ways to use them, but not so much with ranged weapons. They're usually quite good. In Skyrim, I'll grab a bow all day and go hide in a shadow and shoot somebody from a mile away. I don't need a ton of options for that. But still, it'd be nice to know that you had more than just a couple of options. When we are looking at builds in Pathfinder2e, not only can you make compelling ranged builds for classes like Fighter and Ranger and Rogue, there's classes like Gunslingers specifically designed for it. And then some classes like Magus or Monk or Alchemist, Swashbuckler, that have subclasses or specific feats to make you good at ranged. Someday I'll probably make a ranged Swashbuckler build. I know that was kind of the oddball in that list. Or a ranged Monk, which actually isn't. It's quite strong. But for now, we'll just look at the weapons, the traits, and talk about ranged weapons in general. Before we look at ranged weapons, it's important to mention that all ranged attacks use dexterity for the modifier for your chance to hit. So even if you're using what's normally a melee weapon and you're throwing it, that still uses dexterity for your attack roll. So you're not going to be using strength to make attack rolls for ranged weapons. It makes a huge difference when you're thinking about building your character, as you only have one primary ability score. So if you are going a heavy melee build and you're going to throw, your chance to hit is going to be slightly lower when you throw because you're going to have to rely on dex when normally you're relying on strength. Also, ranged attacks don't by default add damage from your strength or dex modifier. In fact, they'll never add it from your dex modifier. So if you've got a short bow that deals 1d6 damage, it's not 1d6 plus your dex mod, it's 1d6. Done. So for those coming from D&D 5e, that's a big change. Thrown weapons, on the other hand, get to add your strength modifier to the damage. So despite the shorter range, you might only have 20 feet on a thrown weapon, at least when you hit, you get to add all of your strength. Up here on screen, I've put another stat block like I did with melee weapons. This one's a composite longbow, as we talked about. So it's a longbow. You can see here it's a martial weapon, and you can see its die size is a D8. It's in the bow group. Makes sense. Again, at level 1, don't worry about the group too much unless it plays into the class you chose. And the type is ranged. The hands listed is 1+, in this case because you only need 1 to hold it, but if you're going to shoot, it takes 2 while you're shooting. And that's about it for the basics that we need to worry about, other than some of the new stuff on here. First one is range. This is the range increment. So how does this work? Right here, you can see on the bow, it says 100 feet. That doesn't mean you can only shoot the bow 100 feet. What it means is, if you're attacking somebody within 100 feet, you get your full +2 attack bonus. But, because it's a range increment, you can shoot it up to 300 feet. 2 more range increments. If it's between the first and second increment, so you're 150 feet away, you're going to have a -2 to your attack roll though. And if they're, say, 250 feet away in that third range increment, it's going to be a -4 to your attack roll, but you can still do it. So you can hit somebody from half a town over. But chance of hitting them is not going to be amazing. The next thing you'll see on here is reload for all ranged weapons. Again, for weapons that are like thrown, they don't have this kind of stat block. There'll be a melee weapon that has the thrown property, so it's different. But on an actual ranged weapon, reload, this is the number of actions it takes to reload a weapon. Notice 0 here is because you don't need to actually take an action. You just knock another arrow and let it loose. Finally, ammunition. This is the type of ammunition that the ranged weapon uses. Arrows for a bow, bolts for crossbows, bullets for guns, things like that. This just tells you what it is. So not a huge deal, but good to know. Now that we can read the basics of a stat block for a ranged weapon, let's go ahead and let's talk about some of these traits. Very similar to what I did with the melee weapons, we're going to go through the most common. Some of those traits from the melee weapons will find their way onto ranged weapons, so check out that video so you know what they are. But I'm going to go ahead and talk about ranged specific traits, so things you're not going to find on your melee weapons. All right, starting with capacity. So this always has a number. This doesn't mean that you can fire that many times without having to reload. You still need to take an action between. You're just taking an action to change the chamber over rather than actually reload the full weapon. So if you look up a slide pistol, for instance, it has capacity 5. You still have to take an action every time to move up the slide, but you don't have to actually fully reload the weapon, and that can occasionally matter, but it's not the most important, I would say. Concussive. Your attacks can be considered either piercing or bludgeoning. The GM will just use whichever one's more damaging to the creature you shot. You don't have to call it out. Double barrel. So you have to load each barrel independently, but you can choose to fire them together. If you shoot them together, rather than doing both their damage added together, you simply increase the die size of a normal shot. So if your weapon has the fatal trait, you increase the die size of the fatal trait as well. So you're increasing die sizes. Could be advantageous, but remember you're going to have 2 actions to reload both barrels. Fatal aim. This lists the die size. So fatal aim D10. And if you wield a weapon in 2 hands, it gains the fatal trait with the die listed. So you're not going to get the fatal trait out of a weapon if you just hold it in one hand. But when you attack with the weapon, using just one hand under like an arm or something, it still works like the normal weapon does. You just don't get that fatal trait. If you remember Fatal from before, or if you haven't watched that video, go watch it. Fatal is very powerful on critical strikes. Kickback. You're firing a very strong weapon that otherwise would be hard to hold, so you need strength to be able to hold it in place while you fire. A weapon with this trait deals 1 additional damage, but you take a -2 circumstance penalty to attack rolls if you don't have a high enough strength modifier. In this case, you need a +2 strength modifier or a strength of 14. Modular. Your weapon has different configurations. The configurations will be listed. Sometimes it'll be different damage types, but in either case, it'll list what your configurations are, and you have to use 1 interact action in order to change the configuration. But at least it gives you options. Propulsive. You can add half your strength modifier, rounded down, to your damage. So if you remember, when we looked at our bow at the beginning here, that wasn't just any bow, it was a composite bow, which means that we can add our strength modifier, half of that, to our damage. So if we have a 14 or a +2, we get to add 1 to our damage. Whereas if we have a 16 strength or a +3, we're still only adding 1 because it's half rounded down. Repeating. This is probably what most people think capacity does. This means you can just keep firing without having to use an action to reload or switch barrel or whatever. This will have a magazine, and in the block about the weapon, it'll tell you how big the magazine is. The trick is when you go to switch out the magazine, it's going to take 3 actions to do a swap of the magazine. So hopefully you can just use the 1 magazine throughout a combat, but if you have to reload into combat, you've got a hold down turn. So there's trade-offs. Scatter. This always has a range, such as 5 feet, and this is your shotgun style effect. So when you attack with this weapon, you deal damage to your primary target like usual, but then you deal damage to every creature within that range of your target, 5 feet. And the amount of damage you do is 1 per damage die of the weapon, which is to say, if you've got a striking rune and you're doing 2d6 with your gun, you'll do 2 damage to everybody within 5 feet. Volley. This is always listed with a range as well. You'll see on our initial weapon that we showed in the block, it had a volley with 30 feet listed. So this is for really long ranged weapons. So if you attack a creature within that range, so between you and 30 feet out, you're actually going to take a penalty to try to hit that creature because they're too close for your weapon. So you don't want to go trying to shoot, a really close enemy with a longbow because you're going to take a -2 penalty to your attack roll. And that's all of the major traits for bows, crossbows, and guns. There are other traits, and we're not going to worry about those right now because they're less common. Hopefully, this makes you feel like you're ready to build a ranged character. I hope the traits were easy to understand, and just go out and find something fun to use. If you have any questions or comments, anything you think I missed or got wrong, please do add them in the comments below. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day, and as always, adventure on.